welcome. My name is Andrea, and I'm one of the co-hosts. I want to welcome you to CUNY-I. The CUNY's Initiative on Immigration and Education Workshop Series, as we call ourselves, CUNY-I, is a New York State Education Department funded project that works to create opportunities for educational stakeholders to learn from immigrant students, families, and educators directly impacted by restrictive immigration policies and educational inequality. At CUNY-I, educators, researchers, and families and local leaders work together to learn about, from, and with immigrant communities, act in ways that center our shared humanity regardless of legal status, and advocate for equitable policies and opportunities. So I want to say thank you for joining our workshop series to learn, act, and advocate together. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Andrea, and I am a PhD student here at the Graduate Center working alongside CUNY-I. My work centers Central American families and Central American experiences of migration, and I look specifically at family separation. I've done some translation work in a detention center in Texas. And so right now I'm working on developing an archive of testimonies of family separation with some colleagues. And I will pass the mic to Jenna, who will tell you a little bit about herself and who we have for you today.
Hi all, welcome, welcome. So I'm Jenna, use she, her pronouns. While I'm introducing myself, it would actually be great if y'all could introduce yourselves too in the chat. So if you want to add your name, if you want to include your pronouns, please do so. And where you're coming from in terms of place or organizational context. So while I'm talking, please throw that in the chat so we can get a sense of who's here. So like I said, my name is Jenna. I am also at the team at CUNY-I and a graduate student at the CUNY Graduate Center. I was an educator for many years in Sunset Park in Brooklyn and come to this work primarily through advocacy that I've done with the New York State Youth Leadership Council. They're the first undocumented youth-led nonprofit in the state of New York. So lots of intersections here in terms of places we're coming from. Super excited for everyone to be here. And now I have the pleasure of introducing VOLS. Really quick before I do so though, just a quick preview of what we're doing today. So they'll have about a 45-minute presentation with legal updates that are important for us to know, particularly in supporting immigrant and undocumented youth. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, and then at the end, we'll have a chance to connect in small breakout groups. For the questions, we ask that you use the chat. So during the presentation, Andrea and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you throw those questions in there while they're presenting, we'll pull them out, try and condense similar ones, and select a few to get to at the end. But now about VOLS. So VOLS, or Volunteers of Legal Services, is a really dope organization. They provide free civil legal services to low-income New Yorkers, and their programs rely on partnerships with pro bono attorneys and community-based organizations. So several schools that I've worked with have had VOLS come into their school and support with presentations like the one we're going to see today. Today, we're joined by three folks from VOLS: Xin-Yen Ling, who's the director of the VOLS Immigration Project; Jennifer Guzman, who's the community advocate at the VOLS Immigration Project; and Emma Morgenstern, who's an Immigrant Justice Corps Fellow and an attorney at the VOLS Immigration Project. And now I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more and get started. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jenna and CUNY, for having us tonight. I'm really excited to be here and to share with you some of the updates that have been coming down the pipeline in the last couple of months. I'm going to screen share our slide. We have a 22 slide PowerPoint to share with you this evening with lots of information. And we're going to take 15 minutes each, and I'm going to start us off with some of the, here we go. As Jenna might have mentioned already, VOLS is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Tribeca. The immigration program provides direct legal services to immigrant youth in New York City. Okay. Biden's first 100 days, what has happened? We're going to be focusing on some border-related issues, lots of changes that we have begun to see. In his first day in office, Joe Biden has ended the Muslim ban. If you recall, approximately several years ago when Trump came into office, one of the first racist and xenophobic things he did was implement a policy that prevented individuals who identified as Muslim from entering into the United States. And if you remember those days, many of us rushed to JFK International Airport as individuals were returning to the United States were prevented and banned from entering and coming in. Luckily, the Muslim ban has ended. There's now proposed legislation introduced and passed in the House called No Ban Ever. And the intention behind the No Ban Ever legislation is to repeal all versions of the Muslim ban, all versions of the asylum ban, and all versions of the refugee ban. The second sort of policy change that has taken place in the first week of Biden's time in office is he's issued a proclamation to end the construction of the border wall. And this is something that we need to celebrate. When he issued the proclamation, the construction wall was to end within 77 days. He was to have a new plan within 60 days, and that 60-day came and went on March 20th. And the purpose of the 60 days was to give the Biden administration the opportunity to reintroduce a new plan to repurpose the wall. But I think he's made it very clear that he will no longer continue the construction of Trump's border wall. But that leaves, I think, an open question of what other enforcement measures this administration is interested in pursuing. The third bullet, end to remain in Mexico policy. This was a inhumane policy that was implemented, also known as the Migration Protection Protocol. It was a program that required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for their immigration court hearings in direct contravention of international law. So the MPP policy has come to an end. And what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, unfortunately, is these characterizations of border crisis. We've heard from the media that there's a surge along the border. Biden has issued a statement indicating that folks from South and Central America should not come. This is all part of, I think, anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've heard before, and we continue to hear in light of the fact that he has ended the Remain in Mexico policy. The last thing that has changed, the Biden administration has created the Family Reunification Task Force. If you recall, one of the things that happened under the Trump administration was he separated children from their parents. And what we've known towards the end of his 4 years was that there are 545 children that have remained separated at the border from their parents that have not been reunited. The purpose of this task force is to find and relocate their parents with the children. So those are some of the changes that we've seen along the border. Okay, the next slide's focusing a little bit more on enforcement and rights, and I think we've come to some sort of, I think, positive changes. One of the proclamations he's issued in his first day in office is a recommitment to the DACA program. and my colleague will focus a little bit more about the DACA program and what has changed since then. There's a redesignation of protections for Liberians and Syrians. And what that essentially means is that we are continuing to provide benefits for the Liberian and Syrian community in the form of DED, which is Deferred and Forced Departure. It's a program that provides work authorization for Liberians through June 30th, 2022. And TPS continues for Syrians, and one of my colleagues will be focusing a little bit more on the TPS policy. The next slide. The TPS for Burmese and Venezuelans, we're really excited to hear that the Biden administration has announced new TPS benefits for new categories of populations, specifically the Burmese and Venezuelan community. And again, we'll focus a little bit more on TPS in a bit. Within the first couple of days, the Biden administration issued a 100-day moratorium on deportations, which is sort of an unprecedented move, which essentially prevents anyone from being deported from the United States. Unfortunately, within days, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed a lawsuit arguing that the moratorium violated federal law and agreements that the Department of Homeland Security signed with Texas, requiring the department to give notice and time for review. And as a result, a federal district court judge in Texas issued a preliminary injunction in February preventing Biden from implementing his 100-day deportation moratorium. As part of the new enforcement measures or priorities coming out of the Biden administration, he has essentially undone Trump's enforcement goals, which is essentially deport everybody. And now he's sort of restricted enforcement measures to apply to 3 categories of individuals. It's not exactly what we want, but certainly I think these new priority goals is much more workable than what we've had in the past. So under the new enforcement memo, the only individuals who will be vulnerable to deportation are people who have allegedly been involved in terrorism, national security, and espionage activities, people who have entered the United States without status after November 1st, 2020, and people who've committed what we call aggravated felonies or gang-related activities. And by no means, this is a large group of individuals. Aggravated felony is a legal definition in immigration law that captures a number of folks, ranging from individuals who've cashed a large check fraudulently that involved $10,000 or more, to gang-related activities, which essentially identifies individuals who are suspected of being a gang member. And these are very problematic, unfortunately. But at this point, it remains to be seen how these enforcement measures are being carried out. And so we're sort of monitoring what's happening at this time. Okay, moving on. In the first couple of weeks in the administration, he's introduced the Citizenship Act of 2021. This was a celebrated moment in part because one of the measures involved is to eliminate from the immigration law the description of immigrants as aliens, right? Words do matter, and how we identify, how we characterize immigrants matter. And so for the first time, judges, USCIS officers, ICE can no longer call an immigrant an alien. So it's a beginning. Now, let's sort of focus a little bit more to the meat of what the Citizenship Act of 2021 does. It provides a path to temporary legal status for 5 years if a person demonstrates that they've been physically present in the United States before January 1st, 2021. And it provides a path to a green card and eventual path to citizenship with processes that are expedited for individuals who are DACA recipients, agricultural workers, individuals who have temporary protected status, and folks who have DED. They can immediately apply for a green card without having to apply for this temporary legal status for 5 years. The Citizenship Act of 2021 does other really, I think, forward-thinking things like clear the backlog. It increases visas per country. It identifies any unused visas and puts them back into the pool. And it provides temporary status for family members with approved petitions. But one of the questions that I think is how viable is the Citizenship Act of 2021? And unfortunately, when it was introduced, it was met with very lukewarm response in both the House and the Senate. And the way in which the Biden administration has repitched the Citizenship Act is to sort of say that it's paved the way for more piecemeal solutions. And subsequently, what we've seen is the introduction of 2 bills, alternative bills to the Citizenship Act of 2021 called the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Both passed the US House of Representatives on March 18th, 2021. The American Dream and Promise Act passed the House by 228 to 197 votes. Both are going to be headed towards the Senate, which requires 10 Republicans to vote with the Democrats to overcome the filibuster. So what does it do? The American Dream and Promise Act provides benefits to about 4 million dreamers, TPS holders, folks with DED, but it also leaves out many millions of undocumented folks. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which we'll focus less on tonight, allows undocumented workers to apply for legal status. And farm workers can apply for a green card if they pay a fine and work in agriculture for an additional 4 to 8 years. Let's move to the next slide. What I'm hoping to do is talk a little bit more in depth about the American Dream and Promise Act, because the bill specifically provides a path to a green card for young people. And how does it do that? It does that through 3 kind of processes or mechanisms. The first step is a young person will get what we call a conditional permanent residency for 10 years if they establish that they entered the United States before their 18th birthday, they've been admitted to an institution of higher education, or they've graduated high school or obtained a GED, and they show that they've been physically present in the United States since January 1st of 2021. The second step, once they've held on to their 10-year conditional permanent residency for 10 years, they can then apply for a green card if they meet one of 3 goals. The first is higher education. In order to apply for a green card, a young person must have acquired a degree from an institution of higher education or completed at least 2 years in good standing in a program for a bachelor's degree or a higher degree in the US. The second option to allow somebody to go from a conditional permanent resident to a green card is if they've completed military service for at least 2 years and was honorably discharged. Or third, a young person can apply for a green card after 10 years of conditional residency, plus they've demonstrated that they've worked for a total period of 3 years and at least 75% of that time, the young person has had a work permit, with some exceptions for those enrolled in a technical school. The third step under the American Dream and Promise Act is citizenship. And after they've had a green card or lawful permanent residence for 5 years, they can then apply for naturalization, demonstrate all the normal eligibility requirements, and take the American civics and English test and get sworn in. Now, the American Dream and Promise Act, I think, in many ways provides many benefits for 4 million people, but it leaves out 7 million undocumented folks. It also, as part of most forms of comprehensive immigration legislation, it also carries enforcement measures. And so if a young person has disqualifying criminal activities, they're not eligible to obtain conditional permanent residency under the law. And some of these activities are anyone who's voted unlawfully. Jennifer, I believe, is going to go into how and when those instances might happen. Anyone who's had a felony offense, 3 or more misdemeanors, or have been arrested and convicted of domestic violence. And in New York, we don't have a domestic violence crime. Usually if somebody is arrested for DV related to a family member, a person is usually charged with a misdemeanor assault in the 3rd degree. The last thing that the disqualifying criminal activities, it creates a secondary review process that allows the Department of Homeland Security to deny applications if a person is a threat to public safety. And what does that mean, a threat to public safety? For the first time, it's inclusive of juvenile offenses, or it involves a conviction of any sort involving a misdemeanor requiring more than 30 days in jail. So in other words, if a young person who had gotten into a little bit of trouble when they were in high school and were arrested before their 19th birthday in New York, you're usually charged as a juvenile offense or a youthful offender, and usually it's resolved by a young person going through programs, and if they complete these programs successfully, the case seals and disappears as though it didn't exist. And that's meant to protect a young person, to ensure that that young person does not have a criminal record moving forward. Now, the secondary review process is problematic because what it does is it takes a youthful offender or a juvenile offense and mischaracterizes it and allows immigration to deny an application. And this is something that this mandatory secondary review has never happened before, so it would be unprecedented. So those are some of the things that I think VOLS is very much concerned about. And while we support the benefits that we see under the American Dream and Promise Act, there are other aspects of legislation that we think is disconcerting. So I'm going to punt it over to Emma to talk a little bit about DACA.
From one program with a lot of restrictions to another. We've been talking a lot about the Biden administration and the changes that have been made so far. And this is actually a change that predates Biden coming into office. The DACA program was fully reinstated as of December 7th, 2020. And it was a court that did that. They told the Trump administration they needed to cease their efforts to end the program. And so since December 7th, 2020, the USCIS has now been accepting first-time applications for the first time since Trump attempted to end the program in 2017. This also means that advanced parole has been reinstated, and that is a program that allows documented individuals to be able to travel outside of the United States and then return, which is not something that was available during this time period. However, when people who have DACA come and talk to you about advanced parole and ask if that's something that they might be able to do, we are cautioning people about the pandemic for several reasons. One of which is that currently the CDC is requiring a COVID negative test in order to re-enter the country from 3 days prior to arrival. So it's a real nightmare scenario to have all the documents to be able to re-enter the country and not be able to come because of inability to get a COVID test or inability to get a negative COVID test. So that is something that we're cautioning about. And in terms of other changes to the DACA program that were made under the Trump administration, work authorization cards had been changed to be issued for 1 year instead of 2 years, essentially doubling the fee for DACA, which is almost $500. So instead of having someone pay $500 every 2 years, they were asking someone to pay $500 every year in order to keep documented status. So that has also been erased with this decision, and all of those cards are being reverted back to 2 years. And if you were issued one of those rare 1 year DACA and work permission cards, that is going to be automatically extended. One piece of information that we are keeping a close eye on and encourage people to watch for in the news is that there is still a pending lawsuit about the legitimacy of the DACA program. So the fight is not over. There is still a judge in Texas who may or may not have a say on this. It wouldn't be the final say. The Biden administration could then act, Congress could then act, but it is something that we are keeping a close eye on. However, people are able to file initial applications for the first time since 2017, and that is something to celebrate. And if you're not familiar with the program, I'm now going to talk a little bit more about its criteria and what it means. So DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's not going to be the last acronym you hear us talking about today. We're addicted to them, and I often forget to describe what they mean when I first say them. It has a lot of requirements, and just like Sinyan was talking about with the Dream and Promise Act, it leaves out a lot of people because it has these very specific requirements that were chosen at a very specific moment in time in 2012 that may or may not apply to someone today who may or may not qualify for this program. Some of the schooling requirements are that you must have either be enrolled in high school or have graduated from high school, or be enrolled in a GED program or have graduated from a GED program. You need or have been honorably discharged from the US Coast Guard or Armed Forces. There's also extensive entry and presence requirements to qualify for the DACA program. You have to have been continuously residing in the United States since June 15th, 2007. And that was one of those requirements that seemed extremely reasonable when the Obama administration put it into effect in 2012, and feels a little bit less reasonable these days when you're looking at trying to show presence from 2007 until 2021. There's a lot of people who are in their 30s who are now trying to gather documents to show that they were here continuously since 2007 until the present. So that is not an easy lift these days. And you need to have entered the United States before you turn 16. So it's deferred action for childhood arrivals. That is also going to leave out a lot of people. If you arrive the day after you turn 16, this isn't a program that you're going to qualify for. So even while we're celebrating the fact that it is possible to file initial applications again, and that is going to help a lot of people gain the benefits that I'm about to talk about, it is also important to remember that this just isn't a program that everyone is gonna be able to qualify for. Some of the benefits of qualifying and of being approved for this program include gaining work authorization for 2 years. So that's going to open a lot of doorways for a lot of people to have that photo ID that allows you to work in many different places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. You can get a social security card, and it provides protection from deportation for that 2-year period, which for a lot of people is a huge change in how you feel day to day. It also includes the possibility of applying for advanced parole, which is the travel program I mentioned earlier. So people who might not otherwise be able to leave the United States and return safely. This program allows people to travel for employment, for school, or to visit serious sick relatives or qualifying sick relatives, or to gain medical treatment outside of the United States. And that is another huge benefit for people who might not otherwise be able to leave the country safely. It also stops the clock on what's called unlawful presence, which is something that accrues if you do not have status in the United States, and it may prevent you from applying for different immigration benefits down the line. So that can be a huge benefit for people who might be eligible for other forms of immigration relief later on, like family-based relief, or people who might get married to US citizens. That can be a huge benefit. And finally, something that's been really important for people during this pandemic is that it actually provides access to unemployment insurance because of that work authorization piece. So if you have DACA, if you have that work authorization card and you've lost your employment, you'll be able to access those unemployment insurance benefits, which have been how a lot of people have been getting by these days. Another, and I apologize for people around 5:36 love to just lay on the horns these days. Another huge benefit of the past few months has been that the wealth test that Trump tried to put into place has been permanently ended as of this month, which is huge news for a lot of people. Trump tried to completely change the way that something called public charge inadmissibility was defined, to almost eliminate the option of applying for family-based immigration relief for a lot of people unless you had a lot of money and could show it. So this is over. The Form I-944 Declaration of Self-Sufficiency has officially been taken off the table, which is a huge relief for a lot of people who might be able to file for their family members and for people who might be able to access relief through a family member. And so now we are back to the old rules, which doesn't mean that public charge has gone away. Public charge was there before the Trump administration took office. However, it's much, much more narrow than it was when Trump was trying to redefine it. So we're now back under the old rules, which means that a non-citizen may not be able to receive a green card through some forms of applying if they've been institutionalized for long-term care, or if they receive public cash assistance like SSI or TANF. This is kind of an interesting space to be in because a lot of people who might not be eligible for those reasons wouldn't necessarily be able to access a green card, or wouldn't be able to access those forms of benefits without being a citizen. Like SSI is something that is not really possible to get if you're a non-citizen. So it's a much more narrow barrier to getting a green card than it was previously. And there are some people who are applying for green cards who public charge does not apply to at all. I'm also going to speak a little bit about temporary protected status. I'm going to talk about the updates and then I'm going to tell you what it is. So bear with me through this slide. You'll also have access to it later, I believe, because there's a lot of information on here. Temporary protected status has been extended automatically for a lot of individuals from a lot of different countries, including Haiti, El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. And the dates through which they've been extended is on this slide. And the big news is that there's actually 2 new countries that have been designated for individuals to be able to apply for temporary protected status. And that is, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, Myanmar, Burma, and Venezuela. And the registration periods are now open, and people will need to apply before September 2021 in order to be in that pool of people who's been registered for temporary protected status. And that will protect them until, for Venezuelans, September 2022, September 9th, 2022, and for Burmese people, it's going to be a form of protection until September 12th, 2022. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what temporary protected status is. So as the name may indicate, it is not a permanent form of relief, and it is not a path in and of itself to a green card or to citizenship. It is a temporary immigration status that is provided to specific nationals of certain countries that are experiencing what the US government has deemed some sort of a temporary problem that would make it difficult or unsafe for that individual to be returned to that country. So it's essentially the government saying people from this country should not be sent to this country against their will, regardless of what the situation is, because of the situation in that country. That could be something like an ongoing armed conflict or a serious natural disaster, such as earthquakes or tsunamis. TPS designations are for 6, 12, or 18 months, and the government will decide whether or not to extend based on whether or not they deem it safe in that country at that time. It also provides work authorization. It also can provide travel documents like the ones that I was talking about under DACA. And it is protection against deportation, which again is a huge relief for a lot of people to have. So if you do have students who are from those countries, especially the ones that are currently open for registration, which is Burma and Venezuela, that is something to send them to talk to an attorney about if that is something that they could access. And from the temporary forms of relief to permanent humanitarian options, I'm going to speak a little bit about political asylum. And before I get into the definition, I also want to distinguish it from refugee status, because those are things that I think a lot of people get confused for extremely good reason. Once you have asylum status or refugee status, they are the same. So that is why it can be very confusing, and people who have had those types of statuses don't even necessarily know which one it is. The difference is the way in which you apply. Refugee status is applied for while outside of the United States. You apply with a body outside of the United States, and you enter the United States with refugee status. Asylum is something that you seek in the United States and apply for while in the United States, with the exception of the MPP program that Sinyan talked about being ended earlier. So an asylum seeker is someone who is going through that process in the United States, whereas if you have a student who came as a refugee, they will already have and hold that status. Asylee or refugee is someone who is unable to return to their country of origin because they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 protected categories: their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or the category that holds a lot of categories, membership in a particular social group. There are some serious restrictions to applying for asylum in the United States. One of those is that you must apply within 1 year of your arrival, which is a really big limiting factor, unless there has been an important circumstantial change either in your country or in your life. An example of this can be if you are applying for asylum because you're a transgendered individual and you have just recently come out, or just recently changed your name, or just recently changed your documents, and now you would be even more unsafe if you were sent back to the country where you came from. That can be a changed circumstance in your life that would enable you to overcome that 1-year bar. Another example is if you're part of a political group and that group is being recently targeted and was in power but came out of power, and now you'd be unsafe. That's another changed circumstance that would enable you to overcome that 1-year bar. If you have asylum granted in the United States, or if you've arrived with refugee status, you are eligible to apply for a green card 1 year after that status was approved. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk to you about special immigrant juvenile status.
Jennifer, you're muted. Or we can't hear you. No.
Do you want one of us to take special immigrant juvenile status and try rejoining? Nod for yes. All right, I'm going to talk to you guys about special immigrant juvenile status, and Jennifer is going to figure out why her speakers aren't working. So special immigrant juvenile status is another thing to be on the lookout for, especially in student populations. It is available for individuals who are under the age of 21, who are unmarried, and who have been deemed dependent on a juvenile court or family court through a guardianship or custody order. The court needs to have issued an order that one or both parents neglected, abused, or abandoned that child, or that one of the parents has died, and that it is not in the best interest of that child to be returned to the country of origin or last habitual residence. So this is something that it's really important to talk to an attorney about if there's a question about whether or not there might be eligibility. It has a component that requires a family court intervention, and also a component that involves applying with immigration. Some things to remember that are important is that the status of the parent or guardian is irrelevant. So it does not matter if the whole family has status, and that doesn't prevent someone from being able to apply. That the form of entry doesn't matter, which is not true in a lot of immigration benefits scenarios. So it's available for people regardless of how they entered into the country. It does provide a path to a green card and therefore to citizenship. So that's a really big game changer for a lot of children in this country. One thing that it is important to talk about with people is that the child in that case can never petition for either of their parents. So even if one of their parents becomes their guardian and it was a different parent from the one who either passed away or neglected, abused, or abandoned the child, they can still never apply for that parent who's their guardian. The cases can take years. A lot of countries are actually retrogressed, which is a whole other thing. So it's important to start very quickly, especially because there is that firm age out date at the age of 21. And the last thing I'm going to say on that is that family court has been closed and they've only been accepting emergency petitions or petitions for people who are aging out, which means turning 21 within 45 days. So it's important to talk to an attorney well in advance so that you can be able to have all of those documents prepared in case that's going to happen. Jennifer, I want to see if you can talk now.
I think I can.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over for real.
Great. So I just want to talk about some things that students should watch out for, especially in the last year when there was a huge push to register as many people to vote. And so perhaps students might have felt pressure to fill out a registration card. And well, although we admire their civic duty, knowing that some students obviously might be undocumented, this is something that they should not do because you can only vote if you are a U.S. citizen. A person who falsely and willfully represents himself or herself to be a U.S. citizen can be fined and imprisoned. It could also have deportation consequences. Unlawful voting is the basis for removal, even if there is no criminal conviction. There's also an inadmissibility bar, meaning a permanent bar to a green card and eventual citizenship if someone does vote. We've had a couple instances where students who were undocumented felt pressured into signing a registration card because, well, everyone in their class was doing so. Everyone in their campus was pushing this form in their face and they're like, okay, I'll fill it out and nothing's gonna happen because, well, I can't vote. So, I'll fill it out, submit it, and nothing's gonna happen. This is not true. Their name is gonna be recorded and there is a way to get their name, their registration canceled. And they should also talk to an immigration attorney to see how they should answer future questions if they ever apply for some sort of residency or citizenship, and how to disclose it when that time comes, and also whatever other consequences might be there if this is something that they do. Obviously, understandably why. If you see everybody doing it, you're thinking, okay, maybe I should too. So it's something that you should warn about. And if you're taking time in class to fill out these voter registration cards, also having a safe space to say that you don't have to if you don't qualify for. Okay. I'd also like to talk about college access for undocumented students. When we talk to community members, especially to students in high school, they're like, I don't have any immigration status. That means I can't continue my education. This is not true. And it's so imperative when they talk to educators. We've heard stories where they go to a teacher, guidance counselor, and they tell them, well, you don't have a social security number. Like, I don't know what to do. Or like, what's your immigration status? We can't help you if you don't even know that, right? And so this is a very traumatic event, and their hopes are cut. Again, here in New York, there's in-state tuition, meaning that undocumented students can pay the same rate tuition as anyone else here in New York, and they won't be considered foreign students who usually have to pay a higher tuition rate. Undocumented students don't have access to federal financial aid or FAFSA. However, in New York, there is a state level financial aid in the form of the New York State DREAM Act, which just passed about 2 years ago, I want to say. And through this, folks are able to get access to TAP. There is an online application that they can fill out. And in order to be eligible for this type of help, they must have graduated from a New York high school and have enrolled in a college within 5 years of graduation. Okay, next. I also want to talk about the Green Light Bill, which provides licenses to all New Yorkers, regardless of their immigration status. And this was implemented December 14 of 2019. This is a standard driver's license. However, on the license itself, it does say not for federal purposes, meaning it can't be used for domestic travel either. In order to obtain this sort of license, you need to show proof of identity, usually through some sort of passport, a New York City identification card, prove your age, and documentation of address. For example, a utility bill. For students, it might be a college identification card or a high school identification card, a transcript. A social security number is not required. However, undocumented folks are required to sign an affidavit saying that they do not have a social security number. We also get questions from the community saying, well, they'll have my passport, they'll have my information. Should I still apply for this? Will this information be shared with immigration? Well, the bill has a privacy clause, and it prevents the DMV from scanning and storing any documents or asking about immigration status. And it's important to have some sort of identification besides a foreign passport, because if someone were to be stopped by some sort of enforcement official, it's not a good idea to be showing a foreign passport. Okay. And many of you guys joining us tonight are probably educators, and you guys are on the front lines. So it's important to understand the circumstances that students might be facing at the moment. There's always a fear of disclosing one's immigration status. There's fear of accessing resources because of public charge rate, which we just mentioned. Even if one is eligible for this sort of resource, they might be frightened to access this information. There's always a fear of deportation, either of oneself, a family member, or a friend. And while COVID-19 has not made anything any easier, especially for our immigrant community, communities of color, our immigrant workers are often considered essential workers, frontline workers. However, they don't have access to any of our social net resources. And so they're really left out of they're put to the side. They're sacrificing themselves or putting themselves at risk. Yet we don't appreciate this, and there's just this double standard where we expect them to continue with their lives for survival because there is no access to additional help, right? And of course, there's also an intersectionality, because an immigrant status or immigration status is only one part or facet of one's identity. They can also be going through other forms of challenges, right? Especially now, as the past year has shown, with the Black Lives Movement, they could, LGBTQ, other sorts of issues that they might be facing as well. And while all this causes stress, anxiety, anger, hopelessness, especially at a time like this, well, it affects the mental and emotional health of a student, while also having to deal with their AP classes or, getting their assignments on time. And well, as educators, what can you do to support your students? Inform them that they can continue their schooling, they can continue with their academic career. There is help here in New York, the New York State DREAM Act. There's also scholarships. You can be a mentor for a student. Representation helps and it matters, right? Also, if you work in a higher education, challenging the accessibility of institutional aid and scholarships, speaking up on behalf of your students as well when they might feel threatened to do so, and creating a welcoming environment for undocumented students. Whether it's in your syllabus saying like, this is a safe space for immigrants. Everything now is being done virtually, some sort of logo in your background to prove that, this is a safe space if someone does want to talk to you. And again, being open to learning, growing, and advocating for your students, donating to emergency funds, because that's what the community had to resort to because there was no access to social safety nets. Supporting the DREAM Act, supporting any respective state legislation to support undocumented students. And well, I'm not, this is gonna be a plug, but legal services are very important. You can refer them to us now that you know about us, but there's also a whole bunch of other great organizations here in New York that provide legal services as well. And also keeping in mind that although you might refer them to an organization for legal services, that doesn't mean that they're going to have a form of relief available to them. As we've reviewed, some of these forms are very stringent, very strict, very narrow, and oftentimes, and often is the case, that we'll have consultations with students and they don't have any form of relief available to them at the moment. And even when they do have a form of relief, such as DACA, this means that they have to prove their presence here in the US for 13 plus years, right? So at making that sort of help accessible in gathering academic records, which are so imperative to something in the application process for DACA at least. You might be even hearing from former students who are trying to access their academic records and making that accessible or guiding them to talk to the right person in the school. Okay. And well, here's another plug. Here's our information. You can feel free to contact us. You have emails and phone numbers.
Thank you all so much for this presentation. There were quite a lot of questions in the chat, so we tried our best to condense them. And I'm gonna throw condensed version in the chat, but I think they're actually related to what we want to start with. So I'll throw them in the chat and then I'll speak those two questions. And then if there are others that come up, we can do that as well. So one we wanted to name because we felt this was particularly important is the first one. As of Monday, there were reports about Haitians that were still being deported under Biden. Can one of you speak to that concern? And then the other current events related question that we're hoping to get to is, do the November 1st enforcement measures include adolescents who entered without their parents? So we'll start there.
Go ahead, Emma.
I was going to throw that to you because I had some feedback on the first part of that question. I'm sorry.
Okay, I thought you wanted to ask that question. I think in terms of the first question, in term with respect to Haitians, you know, I think one of TPS for Haitians is still in play. So folks who identify as Haitians were eligible for temporary protected status. We're waiting for the Biden administration to extend it again. When Trump was in office, there was a pending lawsuit that was filed to terminate the TPS program. That lawsuit is still in play. We're waiting for the administration to continue to either defend it or not. We're hoping that the Biden administration won't. And so right now we're waiting to see at this time. In terms of Haitians who are not eligible for TPS, if you go back to one of the slides that I focused on, which are these new enforcement priorities, meaning individuals that the administration is prioritizing for removal, they made it very clear that anyone who entered the United States without legal status after November 1st of 2020 will be vulnerable, but anyone who came into the US before then will not. Obviously, there's some caveats, but I think we're waiting essentially to see how this administration is playing out its enforcement. I want to be optimistic, but at the same time, we have seen in these last couple of months community members being subject to removal, right? So it's a wait and see at this time. And then there was a second question, I think. Can you repeat that question?
The next question was, do the November 1st enforcement measures include adolescents who are entering without their parents?
Emma, did you want to take that? Was that the adolescents who are entering the United States without their parents? So the latest that we have heard, and again, going back to the media hysteria, which I really think is driven by the anti-immigrant rhetoric of this border crisis, this surge at the border. What we have learned in the last couple of weeks through our coalition members is that young people, unaccompanied minors, are starting to make their way through the border. And they are being held if they're here without mom or dad or without any adult or guardian. They're being held at the border at a foster home. They're being tested for COVID negative. And if they are COVID negative, they're then flown to reunite with their family members in New York City. And so we've heard that has begun in the last couple of weeks based on some of the groups that we work with.
I also wanted to clarify on temporary protected status that while it is open to people who meet the qualifications from that country, it doesn't protect everyone from that country automatically. And there absolutely have been people removed from those countries since Biden took office, which is why those registration periods are so important, because you have to have TPS to be protected by it. And I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear earlier too.
The next set of questions, I think, which once again, we tried to condense, and I'm apologizing in advance if your question isn't covered, but are more specific questions about some of the things you spoke to. So the first is, do conditional permanent residents qualify for everything long-term permanent residents qualify for, like FAFSA?
So I think the term conditional permanent residency comes from the more recent bill that was introduced called the American Dream and Promise Act, right? If you remember from the earlier slide, if a young person has demonstrated all the requirements, they would get something called a conditional permanent residency for 10 years. As to whether they'll be eligible for FAFSA, I think that's a really great question. I don't really know the answer to that. My sense is that, and Jennifer can chime in, but up until this point, even DACA recipients, right? When the DACA program was created in 2012, and as states has passed in-state tuition measurements for young people who are dreamers, the federal government has not allowed for tuition assistance. So FAFSA has not been available for DACA recipients, and I'm not convinced that even if the American Dream and Promise Act goes through and passes both the House and the Senate, that FAFSA will be an option for young people. But I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just being pessimistic, which I have a tendency to be.
The next question is a clarification around DACA. There were a couple different questions, but I was hoping you could clarify whether DACA eventually leads to a green card or if there are any connections there.
Jennifer, did you want to answer that, Jennifer?
Yeah, so DACA is a form of temporary relief. It is not a permanent form of relief. It does not provide a pathway to residency or eventual citizenship. As we've seen in the last 4 years, we've been on a roller coaster ride of emotions with DACA, because one day it's about to end, another day it's back, another day it's back, but like halfway back, not really fully back. And now it's completely back as it was originally back in 2012. But as Emma had mentioned, there's still litigation around it in Texas. So again, it's just to prove it's not, doesn't provide a pathway to citizenship, and it's not permanent.
The next one is around Medicaid. So is Medicaid no longer a public charge?
Emma, did you want to answer
that? My understanding is no, but also there's a distinction between federal and state Medicaid, and state Medicaid actually never was, even under the draconian Trump administration rules. But we are back to the advice that we were giving even during the Trump administration's public charge crackdown, which was that if you are eligible for benefits, or people in the family are eligible for benefits, we are always recommending that people sign up for them and get the assistance that they qualify for, because it's generally not going to be make or break for immigration status, but it can be make or break for whether or not your family is going to be okay. And that is definitely true for Medicaid during a pandemic.
Yeah, and just to add on to Emma's answer, often in mixed status families, we see that the parent may be claiming benefits for the child. The benefits are not for the parent, they're for the child. And so if the child is eligible for those benefits, please go ahead and claim those benefits if you're eligible for them.
The next question is, can students with F1 visas become legal residents?
So a young person who is an F1 is here for the purposes of studying. And there is no direct path to a green card or a direct path to citizenship from an F1 student visa. However, like most situations, the longer they're here, the more roots they build, the more equities they have, that could potentially change, but there is no direct path to a green card from an F1.
And then there were a few questions about the process of the Dream and Promise Act. So I was wondering if you could talk about, just clarify that it's not passed yet, but what the steps we think are that are needed to pass it.
Oh boy. So that's correct. The American Dream and Promise Act is not law yet. It is merely introduced and passed in the House of Representatives. It is now heading towards the Senate for a vote and a debate. And as most of you all probably know, in the Senate, there are very strange rules called the filibuster. And so in order to actually go to a vote, one must end the debate. In order to end the debate, we need 10 Republicans to vote in support of the American Dream and Promise Act. And if you recall, during the last vote that took place regarding Trump and whether he should be ousted from office, we didn't have all the Republicans. They voted along Republican Party lines. So, you know, I think it faces an uphill battle in the Senate. But I think Biden, if it makes it past the Senate, Biden has committed to supporting the American Dream and Promise Act. And as we mentioned, you know, there are some good aspects of the bill, but there's also some worrisome aspects of the legislation, and who knows what it may look like in terms of its final product.
Thank you. And then there were also some questions about the fine connected to the farm workers bill. So kind of what's the rationale behind it? Are agricultural workers guaranteed a livable wage? And if the bill passes, how would the fine get paid? Like weekly, monthly, yearly, at one time?
I'm not as familiar with the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. I mean, the purpose of the bill is to address the labor crisis, right? There are insufficient, as we've seen in the last year during COVID-19, American citizens do not want to take on agricultural work. And so we do need immigrants to fill those roles. As with most proposals, whether it be piecemeal solutions or comprehensive immigration bill, there are always mandates to pay taxes, to pay fines, to demonstrate your time in the United States. And so in many ways, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act also requires additional conditions to be met before a person's allowed to adjust their status.
I think we actually managed to get through most of the questions and almost perfectly on time. So that was incredible. I'm gonna transition over to Cynthia, but just thanks again, VOLS, for coming, sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. And I left the link to the PowerPoint in the chat. So thank you again.
Perfect. As folks are kind of transitioning out, thank you so much for VOLS for being a part of this and for allowing us to answer a ton of questions that folks were having while you all were presenting. And thank you again for sharing the slides. I think that'll be really helpful for folks. We'll also look at ways to kind of share those materials either on our website or in anything else that might be helpful for folks who are in the Facebook Live or folks who didn't get to attend but are watching this at another time. What I wanted to kind of share, oh, well, also, hello everyone, my name is Cynthia Carvajal, I'm the project director for CUNY-I. Just letting you all know who I am. What I wanted to share before we kind of do a bit of more of an interactive opportunity is I wanted to share more of these upcoming workshops that we're having. And so you can see here the workshops that are coming up. We have them once a month, exactly at this time, 5 to 6:30 Eastern time. The days vary, but next month in April will be UndocuArt at the intersection of immigration and education. So we'll be having some undocumented artists come and talk about what their work means to them, kind of showcase some of that work here, and hopefully do an interactive opportunity as well where folks can engage with them. And you'll see kind of in May, organizing at the intersection of immigration and education. And then in June, fostering conversations across border at the intersection of immigration and education. So we hope that you all can join us there. I want to share the link for the registration in the chat in case you haven't registered. You're here, so you probably did, but just in case you haven't, I'll put it here and you can share with other folks as well. That kind of closes off the Q&A presentation portion of this. And so we'll be doing kind of some breakout rooms. At this time, I wanted to say thank you to the folks who are joining us on the Facebook Live, to please look out for some more information for our next workshop that I just shared. If you'd like to participate in these breakout rooms, so we have breakout rooms in the February one and this one as well, please be sure to join us on Zoom next time, and then you'll be able to participate. But for now, we'll go ahead and stop the Facebook Live.